I wanted to just take a moment to tell you a little bit about my experiences this past week. I was speaking at a lectureship down in Houston, Texas, at the South Side congregation in Pasadena. And the first night of the lectureship, my topic was faithfulness in the midst of doubt. And I was presented with an opportunity to practice what I preached while I preached. Because at supper, just before services that night, one of the clasps on my suspenders broke, leaving only one suspender to bear the load normally assigned to two. And rather than go home and get a belt, I decided, even in the midst of my doubts, to be faithful and keep preaching. And fortunately for all parties involved, one suspender was good enough to do the job. So when I told that story to the congregation, which is the church where Brother D. Bowman preached and labored for many years, his dear widow, Norma, told me she would bring me something. And the next night, she brought me a bag containing 3 pairs of Brother D. Bowman's suspenders, one of which I wore on Thursday night. And so I told the audience I could never fill D. Bowman's shoes, but he's helping me hold up my pants. So that was my experience last week. Friday, as I was getting ready, packing to leave the hotel, the word broke that the Supreme Court had overturned the Roe versus Wade decision, which means that now each state will determine its own laws through the legislative process. As you guys know, I talk about this issue a lot. Usually in January, around the anniversary of the Roe versus Wade decision and Martin Luther King Jr. Day, I talk with you about one or the other, and often both, of 2 issues that are fundamental issues about human personhood and dignity, which is abortion and racism. Maybe this weekend we'll start a new tradition of reminding us of what our duty is as Christians on the basis of this new ruling. Well, what's next? What are we supposed to do as Christians in view of this decision? That's what I want to focus with you on today. Today's sermon is not so much going to be about issues like the biblical and moral matters regarding abortion, which hopefully by now, after so many sermons, are familiar to you. And to be quite frank, I think that most people, even those who are ardently pro-choice, understand that what is in the womb is not just fetal tissue. And as the pro-abortion rights advocates have become more extreme, they are saying this openly. When the news first leaked a few weeks ago that the court may issue the ruling that it did, protests broke out like this one at a Catholic church in New York City, in which a performance artist strapped little baby dolls to herself and started screaming, "I'm killing babies, and God killed his son, why can't I?" I think that most people deep down inside know that a baby in the womb is a human being. Just the other day, I was watching an interview of the cast of Seinfeld talking about different things related to the production of the show. And one of the things they talked about was how they worked around the pregnancies of the actress who played Elaine, Julia Louis-Dreyfus, and the things they did to keep filming and sort of hide her pregnancy. Like they would have her put on big oversized coats, she would walk around with pillows, which gave me some ideas. But anyway, in the course of while they were talking about this, Larry David, who is the co-creator of the show, said to her, "It must be neat for your children to watch episodes knowing that you're carrying them." And she said, "Yeah," and I happened to do a screen capture of closed captioning where the actress says that she told her son Charlie when they were watching a particular episode, "Hey Charlie, look, that's you in my tummy. That's you in my tummy." She didn't say, "That's fetal tissue in my tummy." She didn't say, "That's a part of my body in my tummy." She said to her son, "That's you in my tummy." So I think most people recognize that what we're dealing with here is a human life. And I think most people understand that this is not about the difficult cases that are involved with rape and incest. As a reporter, not an opinion writer, a reporter for USA Today newspaper, pointed out in this story, the headline of which is "Rape and Incest Account for Hardly Any Abortions." And she pointed out what is statistically obvious. Those hard cases represent only a minuscule fraction of abortions. These charts are from the research arm of Planned Parenthood, which overwhelmingly show the small number of abortions that take place because of those hard reasons. The overwhelming number of abortions essentially are performed as birth control after the fact. The issue is whether innocent human life in the womb is of higher value than personal freedom. And for those who believe that we are made in God's image, male and female, the answer is clear. Now, I think there is probably a little bit of a generation gap divide in some of the jubilation over this decision. And that's because if you were born after 1973, you don't remember how stunning the original Roe versus Wade decision was. And that's the word that Time magazine used. This is a screen capture of its initial report about the decision that took place. And you will see that it characterized the decision as a stunning approval of abortion. And in fact, if you were to read this article as it talks about the decision, it rightly noted that this decision was going to force every state in America to make its laws more lax. Even the 4 states at the time, which were Washington, New York, Hawaii, and Alaska, that allowed unrestricted abortions. Some of you are not even old enough to remember the early 90s, when even those who were pro-abortion rights spoke in terms of abortion being safe, legal, and rare, a mantra invented by President Clinton. Unfortunately, the pro-choice movement has grown much more extreme since those days as our culture has coarsened, openly rejecting that abortion should be rare and advocating for abortion on demand. And even though Roe has been overturned, we should not assume that somehow this issue is settled forever. In the first place, many states are going to pass laws about abortion that give broad legal protection to it. And even those who live in states that pass more restrictive measures are still going to be able to travel to get abortions or may acquire abortifacient drugs. So, as Christians, what is our next step? Well, for my sermon today, I want to focus with you on what Luke read for us from Matthew 5, the Beatitudes of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus explains how citizens of the kingdom of heaven should live. And that is, as Jackson pointed out in his table talk today, that's what we are first and foremost. So, here are some thoughts for how we as Christians can respond to this decision. First of all, be humble. Let's read Matthew 5, verse 3. "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." When I say be humble, I don't mean don't celebrate. There have been times in our nation's history when grave offenses against the image of God have been rectified, and that deserves celebration. When the 13th Amendment was passed and slavery was made unconstitutional, superseding, by the way, an infamous Supreme Court decision, the Dred Scott decision, which said that slaves were not persons, that was cause for celebration. And the events of this week deserve thanksgiving to God as well. Because if the government has any purpose at all, it is to protect the innocent, and the oppressed. But there is a way to celebrate that is prideful and gloating. And that is not how citizens of the kingdom of King Jesus are to celebrate. We are to be poor in spirit. We are to be meek, recognizing that any ultimate vindication of good over evil comes through God. It's not going to come through any man or any group of people. And we are to be grateful, but also to be mindful of those who mourn, those who in a painful moment of desperation decided to end an unborn life and have carried the guilt ever since. One time I was preaching a meeting somewhere, and I was talking about some of these contemporary moral issues. And a much older lady in the congregation asked if she could talk with me. And so we met, and she basically told me a story that when she was younger, many years ago, she became pregnant, and her husband said, "We've got all the children we're going to have." And so she terminated the pregnancy. And in tears, she wanted to know if she could be forgiven. And it was a privilege to reassure her of the grace of Jesus Christ that is greater than all our sins. But decades later, she still bore the heartbroken grief of guilt. It is good for us to remind ourselves that what appear to be on the surface political events are just a reflection of a much deeper spiritual conflict. And in that conflict, there are casualties. There are spiritually wounded people who grieve over their wounds. And Jesus says that we need to comfort those who mourn, as someday he will comfort them forever. So here's the second lesson. Be hungry for righteousness. Verse 6 says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied." Now, the first part of this verse is easy to understand. Hunger and thirst, that is to have a deep desire for something that you desperately need. But for what exactly in this verse? Most of our translations say righteousness, but that's a pretty broad term. It can refer to what is right or just. It can refer to what God makes right or just. And if that's what Jesus has in mind here, to have a craving, a desire for God's righteousness to be done, then this would be very similar to the language of the prayer in the next chapter that Jesus teaches the disciples to pray. "Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done." And certainly we as Christians should have a great desire for God to make things right and for his will to be done and for injustice and oppression against the innocent to cease. But my guess is that here Jesus doesn't have God's righteousness in mind, but ours. Ours in the sense of having a craving or a longing to live justly and righteously. This is what Jesus addresses just a few verses later in verse 20 when he says, "For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." All right, so if my righteousness has to exceed theirs, what was their righteousness like? Superficial, very much focused on externals, and hypocritical, always eager to point out the faults of others, but never willing to look and examine their own lives. So what Jesus is saying is our commitment to be righteous has to arise from deep within, from our heart, and not just for show. And I will say, especially at a time like this, when there's a lot of attention on one particular hot button issue, it is good to be reminded there are many ways to be unrighteous. Like, for example, verse 21, "You've heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment.' But I say to you that everyone who's angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council. Whoever says you fool will be liable to the hell of fire. Rather than thinking merely about what others have done, we need to shine the spotlight of God's word deep within our heart to examine, for example, our attitude toward our brothers, as Jesus says here, with the hope that by his grace, that desire for righteousness will be satisfied. And in those times when we do think about the mistakes that others have made, Jesus says, be merciful. Verse 7, blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. I've known other women who found themselves in the situation that I described a second ago, of where they were pregnant and they had no support from the father of the child. And I know that in a different generation, young ladies who found themselves pregnant out of wedlock often face not only a double standard of criticism for their behavior with no comparable criticism for the behavior of the young men sowing their wild oats, and also cruelty and scorn. Like the mother of this baby. That's me, in case you don't recognize my charming, handsome looks. You can see as I look at this picture where Ralph Walker says all newborn babies look like Winston Churchill, right? I just need the stogie and making the peace sign. I'd look like Winston Churchill. My mom told me some stories of how people reacted to her as a single unwed mother in the late 1960s. A stigma that was often projected onto the baby. I think I've shared some of those stories with you in the past. Jesus says that we are to be merciful. We are to show kindness to those who are hurting. And I recognize that it is very difficult to walk the tightrope between conviction, which confronts sin, and compassion for the sinner. But after all, that is what the gospel is all about. The cross is all about condemning sin and saving sinners all at the same time. And we want every person here, particularly every young lady here, to know that you are in a place where we will have your back. And we will help you deal with whatever bad choices you've made, whoever you are, as we show mercy to each other. And I get it that in the past, especially in a different era, Christians could be very cruel and harsh, and they still can be. But I want you to know it is also the case, even in the past, that God's people could be warm and caring, even as they are also today. Like for this daughter of an unwed mother. That's Christy, in case you don't recognize her. I'm smiling because I can hear her in my head saying, how could you show that picture? Look how chunky my legs look. So I'm hearing her reacting to me sharing this picture. Christy was born in a home for unwed mothers. Those were places that were available in the 60s. And then she was eventually adopted by Bob and Jackie. And over the years, I have known many open-hearted Christians who have adopted and fostered or informally fostered children who were in need. In fact, just out of curiosity, if you have done that, adopted, fostered, or otherwise cared for children in this situation, would you raise your hand? I'm just kind of curious to see how many we have here. We have several. And I have seen the development of organizations like Sacred Selections, which provide legal and financial help for adoptions, which all reflects a general trend that shows that professed Christians are 2.5 more times likely to adopt than non-Christians. So when I say be merciful, understand for you, this is not some kind of corrective admonition. This is an encouraging recognition of what you were doing already. So what do we do next? Be humble, be hungry, be merciful, be pure. Matthew 5, verse 8, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Abortion is one symptom of an underlying issue, and that underlying issue is how we understand the purpose of sex. Biblically, this special capacity for physical intimacy is uniquely connected to marriage, to unite a man and woman in the one flesh relationship that marriage embodies, and to produce children in that stable and committed context. Our culture long ago lost that vision. And while I wish I could say God's people have always been countercultural, we all know that's not the case. And in fact, even in the face of what does seem like good news, which is statistically abortion rates have declined and teen pregnancy rates have declined, and even sexual activity among teenagers has declined, that good news is even mitigated by the fact that one of the underlying reasons for this is the explosion of the availability of pornography. What one writer in this article calls pathologies of passivity, which is creating a whole new set of social disorders in which the blessing of the gift of marriage is replaced by loneliness and isolation. And so you and I have lots of work to do with our kids to teach a vision of human flourishing, a vision of flourishing that is based on purity and fidelity and intimacy. Now, of course, our friends who don't follow Jesus Christ don't share this vision of sexuality or of humanity, and increasingly they are becoming hostile to those of us who do. So look at Matthew 5, verse 9. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you, and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. In the face of this kind of rejection, Jesus says, be glad. Now, if you can, be a peacemaker. Friday, when I saw the news, I felt like this was time to celebrate. I don't do much on Facebook, especially that's serious, because it is not a good venue, in my opinion, for serious discussion of complex issues. But this was a special day. So I made a very basic post with just the words life, justice, Christ, love, redemption, mercy. Literally, that's all that it said. But as you guys know, I have a pretty diverse group of Facebook friends, many of whom are from poles apart where we are. And one of them very quickly responded angrily, "This is no day for celebration," and so forth. And fortunately, I happened to see that as I was getting on the shuttle to go to the rental car place, from the rental car place to the airport. And so I had time through that ride and then making my way through the airport to get to the gate to think through, what do I want to say? The backstory is the gentleman who made this comment is one of my barbershop friends. I think religiously, politically, morally, we are as far apart as you could be. A few years ago, when my quartet was still very active, we had a show in the area where he lives, and he came to it. And he came up to me, and he said, for certain circumstances in his life, he had reached the point where he had decided to take his life. And the day that he was planning to do that, a DVD of my quartet arrived in the mail that he had ordered. And he popped it in and watched it. And you guys know music has a rare capacity to minister to people. And he said to me, after I watched that, I decided not to take my life. I mean, it's just staggering. That was about 7 years ago. So when he said the things that he did, and I had a chance to calm down and think through it, I just said to him, on any other day, I would be eager to debate these issues with you. But today is just a day of celebration for many of us. And I said, just suffice it to say, every life made in God's image has eternal value, including yours. And I'm grateful for your friendship. And a little while later, he responded in the most kind way. I have to confess, that's not the original draft of what I wanted to say. But just the night before, I had preached on similar things as I'm talking about now. Blessed are the peacemakers. Now, I wish I could say that all of my efforts to make peace went as well as that. If you happen to see that thread, you know it most certainly did not. Another guy I've known for a long time said to me, "You are celebrating the deaths of women because of your religious beliefs that women are inferior to men." And trying to get his attention, I just said, do you really think that's what you should say to somebody who has watched his wife die? That I'm celebrating the deaths of women? A woman who was stronger than I'll ever be? And he said, yes, if your wife was still alive, she would be so ashamed of you. Well, Christy probably would be for a lot of reasons, but this issue is not one of them here. Now, this is hardly the persecution of the prophet Jeremiah. But it is the very thing Jesus speaks about in verse 11 here, when he says that people will revile you and utter evil against you. And if we are going to stand for what is right, we have to accept that that is the case. And I will tell you that I was frustrated and I was livid, and Jesus says, Shane, be glad. Be glad. Rejoice and be glad. And frankly, standing for what is right is going to require of us, at least for now, a very small cost compared to what it has cost other people. It is certainly possible that the hate against those who support the cause of life is going to escalate. And I think it's good to remind ourselves, if that happens, it will be nothing new. In the 1960s, there was violence directed against those who sought to uphold the dignity of all races, like this terrible church bombing of an African-American congregation in Birmingham. And there were so many episodes like this in Birmingham that it acquired the grisly nickname of Bombingham in the 60s. And those of us who are pro-life must be humble and meek enough to acknowledge that there have been episodes where violence has been perpetrated by those who claim to be pro-life. So it is easy to allow the tactics and impulses of the kingdom of men to infiltrate us in the kingdom of Christ. So don't lash out in anger and hate to those who are filled with hate. That accomplishes nothing other than undermining the very faith we claim to uphold. Instead, Jesus says, be glad. Be glad that if you are slandered and maligned, you are in good company. You're in company with Jesus. And be glad. So as I took the shuttle from the rental car place to the airport, the driver was an older black gentleman, and it was just us in the vehicle. And really, literally, it had just happened, and so he brought it up to talk about it. And as we were talking, I just tried to think about what I thought his age was and what I thought his life experience must have been. And I just said to him that he probably better than most people could understand that changing laws or court decisions is a different matter from changing hearts. So that's our work. That's what's next. Jesus' command to be humble and merciful and hungry and pure and glad is always pertinent to citizens of the kingdom of heaven. Our mission today is no different than it was on Thursday, which is to go and make disciples of all nations, to baptize them into the name of the Father, Son, and Spirit, to teach them all the things that Jesus has given us, with the promise that he will be with us always. That's what's next. That's what will eternally change the hearts of people. And if there is somebody here this morning who has yet to be baptized into Jesus Christ, so that his death and resurrection, his victory over sin and death, the peace that he has won can be yours, we would love to help you do that this morning. And if we can encourage you, comfort you, be merciful to you, let us know while we stand and sing together.